Police officers, who's the smartest criminal you've ever encountered? Story 1. Most of them are really stupid, so this guy isn't a criminal mastermind, but here goes. He wanted to rob a jeweler on our city's main street, so he found out that the flat beside the jeweler's was empty and he hid there. For 2 weeks, he triggered the alarm on purpose several times a night. Massive headache for the police and the business, and we turned up to see nothing there, nothing on the cameras, and thought it was just a fluke. So the jewelers turned off the alarm system and said that they'd wait until the morning to get a new one installed, or that one rewired because something just wasn't right. As soon as he heard that and the police were leaving, he tore down the wall. Now, he already had been working on this apparently, and then robbed the place taking his sweet time. Escaped without anyone noticing anything for hours until the jeweler came back in the morning. Then he tried to resell something he stole which had a serial number on it and got caught. So, not so smart after all. Good effort though. Story 2. The story goes like this. A homeowner walks out one morning to drive to work only to find his car missing. He reports the car stolen to the police, and a few days later, his car is sitting in front of his house. When he gets inside, he finds a note. It was an apology and said that the thief was in dire need of quick transportation, so he borrowed the first car he found with the keys inside. The writer noticed the sticker on the car for the local sports team, and just so there were no hard feelings, he left 4 tickets to an upcoming game in the glove box for the homeowner and his family. So, the homeowner and his family attend the game, but when they return home, they find that the house had been ransacked and all items of value are gone. Yeah, this is some like next level Wet Bandits type of thinking here. It was kind of brilliant, really, but I'm sure that there could be other ways to ensure that the family was out of the house without stealing the car in the first place, because now you've probably left evidence all over the inside of the car and the inside of the house. Odds of your fingerprints and DNA being found probably just went way up. But hey, points for creative thinking, I guess. Story 3. I knew this guy back in the early 80s. Let's call him Jim. Well, he really wanted this high-powered superbike, but he knew that he couldn't ever afford it. So what he did was take a drive out to London and scouted about for a few days until he found this particular model parked outside a house. He goes back that night with a slide hammer, pulls the lock, and steals the bike. He gets it home, puts it in his garage, and completely strips it so that the only thing left is the frame and the bottom half of the engine, which he drags into the weeds at the bottom of his garden. Then he pours fuel over it and burns it a bit. A few weeks pass and weeds have started growing over it. Now, it's at that point that he calls the cops and reports that someone had dumped a bike frame in his garden. The cops show up and he explains that he just got back from being away and found it. The cops take the frame and note down his name and address. And a few days later, the cops call him and say that the bike had been stolen from London a month or so ago, from the serial number on the bottom half of the engine and frame, and that the insurance company had classed the bike as a write-off and had told the cops to dispose of it. Now, because the frame was found in his garden and the insurance company didn't want it, the cops were duty-bound to ask him if he wanted to keep it, or they should just throw it. So he tells him that he'd always wanted to build a bike. So he gets the frame back from them, repaints it, and then puts it all back together and re-registers it as a Q-Reg, stolen and recovered. Story 4. Obligatory, not a cop here, but close on 20 years ago now, a guy on Australia's Gold Coast got away with a bank robbery in broad daylight. He cased the bank out for a while and discovered a pattern of the bank manager arriving about 30 minutes before anyone else each morning, where he would leave the front doors unlocked so staff could help themselves in without a key, or needing to wait for the boss to come and let them in. One morning, the crook dressed himself up for a busy day of office work and waited for the bank manager to arrive. As the bank manager was unlocking the doors, he made his move, entering the building and threatening the manager with a gun. He got all the details he needed to access the vault and so forth, and then tied the manager up and stuffed him in his office. When the staff arrived, he told them that the manager had called in sick and that the regional office had sent him in to do an open shop thing, and no one batted an eyelid. This bank had a small walk-in vault that normally would only hold about 30 to 50,000 on any given day, but an old mate had timed his robbery for the morning after business banking day when all of the local small businesses would make their end-of-week deposits, and reportedly got away with a score of close to 250,000. Once the vault was opened, he pulled his gun out and then invited all the staff to enter the vault and lock them in. Now, by this stage, the bank was due to be open, so when he went to leave, there were a number of customers waiting to get inside to do their banking. He told them all that there had been an issue with the computers and that the tech team had estimated that it would take about 30 minutes before the issue would be resolved, and that they couldn't open it until then. Then he got into his car and drove straight to the airport and flew to Hong Kong, and then disappeared. To my knowledge, the cops never caught him and never managed to find the money. They knew that he would have to leave most of it in Australia somewhere because you could only take $10,000 in cash of any currency out of the country before customs pulls you into their interview room, so the assumption was that he had an accomplice here who would funnel the money for him slowly over time. I'm impressed at the level of planning that went into this little operation, and even more surprised that he pulled this off all by himself, at least the robbery part. I think that there was a good point here that he must have had some help after the fact getting the money fed to him. But if you're patient and think ahead, I guess there are ways to do that without attracting too much attention, I suppose. Maybe slowly shipping the cash in small amounts? I don't know. In the comments, how do you guys think that the cash was moved? Story 5. Not a police officer, but was an RA in college. My university owned all the houses adjacent to campus. These were ran like dorms, with RAs and the same rules, which included a very strict no alcohol policy. It was a privilege to live in the houses, and priority was given to upperclassmen who were more likely to bend that rule because they were of age, and it was harder to police off campus in houses. There was a student who went around knocking on doors saying something like, "I'm an RA and the housing director sent me for health and wellness checks." She'd find their booze, take it, and then follow up with how she's doing them a favor by just giving them a warning. He actually wasn't an RA and was just keeping the booze for herself. The only reason she got found out was because she did it to an actual RA. And the RA was male, and they kept men and women housing separate, and just assumed that he didn't know her because of that. It was only later that he questioned why they had a female doing wellness checks on a male housing. They did an investigation and asked other residents, and incidents dated back 2 years. Never found out who it was. Story 6. Probably someone who committed a crime I'd never solved. With that being said, I had a guy use a sledgehammer to smash his way through a wall at a Best Buy and steal a bunch of phones and cameras. He was smart enough to wear gloves and a face mask and did not touch anything he didn't have to. Alarms didn't go off until he exited out the back door, which the alarm company gets after a minute or two, and takes them like 3 to 4 minutes to call in to us, giving him a good 5-minute head start, so he was probably a few miles away before we got dispatched to it. He clearly scoped out the area before doing his deed too. Smart guy. Story 7. A guy, let's call him Dave, that I worked with told me this story. He was working at a Mercedes dealership, and he was sitting at his desk when this well-dressed gentleman came in and asked if he could test drive a specific car that was parked out front. It was also a very busy day. Now, usually they are allowed to let people test drive by themselves after they have taken some form of deposit or something, maybe the official ID or something that's not really relevant. So Dave gives out the keys, and the guy goes on his test drive and then comes back a reasonable amount of time later. He walks in and hands off the key, gets his deposit or whatever back. Now, this was about closing time, even possibly on a Friday. Everything is in order. Fast forward to the next business day. Dave's boss walks in and realizes that one of the Mercedes out front is gone. Dave has to explain that the car was returned and that they have the key and everything. Turns out the criminal didn't test drive it. He actually drove somewhere to create a replica of the key and gave that replica back to the desk. He kept the real key. So help me out here, guys. Is this criminal actually that smart? Because he still showed up at the dealership, presumably showing his face for the security cameras, and leaving an ID or something behind that could be used to identify him. And he could have accomplished the same theft if he had just never returned the car from the beginning. Like, it's the same outcome. The difference is maybe he bought himself a little bit more time by doing it over the weekend so that he wouldn't be noticed right away that the car was gone. I don't know. Just seems like an unnecessary step to create the fake key. Story 8. Not a cop, but there was this incident in Fargo, North Dakota, where a guy wanted to steal electronics equipment. Now, the store had plenty of alarms on it, and generally cutting an alarm triggers another alarm, so instead he cut all the alarms. This was before cell phones were really widespread, and alarms were usually just connected to the phone line. He found an access point to one of the phone company's big trunk lines, 9 access points, and a massive thick copper wires with tens of thousands of lines running through them. He had cut through the whole thing with a circular saw, knocked out phone service to most of the town, and then robbed an audio store during the ensuing chaos. There were no leads until a tip came in from another town that he pulled off something similar. They hadn't been able to pin that one to him, but had strong suspicions and that he'd relocated to Fargo. So the cops pay him a visit. Now, he refused to let them in because they didn't have a warrant, so the cops left to get one without having anyone watch him, and then he split. When they came back, they found the saw coated in copper dust and a lot of the stolen stuff. He was in the wind for a while, but even after he got caught, he had another card to play. While being transported between prisons, he used a key that he'd made to unlock his shackles and climbed out into the roof vent of the bus. Story 9. Dude noticed that the bank vault had put its safety deposit box in a way that there was a space at the 90-degree point that the wall meets the wall. He timed it on a Friday and then climbs and hides in that one spot. He had actually rented out a box, which he put a clock in, which alarms violently to see if there are sound sensors in the vault. Waited outside, nothing. Employees closed the vault with him inside, and he was there the whole weekend and gets to knock the locks out with a hammer one at a time and steals everything. He then replaced the locks back to look like they were not tampered with and then jumped back into the spot. Monday morning, the vault was open. Turns out the bank was doing renovations. He picked that day. Throws on a worker's jacket and literally walks out of the bank. Employees did not notice until the first person who came to open his safety deposit box, and the lock just fell in. They could not identify who did it, and he would have gotten away with it save his big mouth. Turns out he was a hairdresser and kept telling his customers how he stole from the bank and that he was a genius and that they would never catch him. Someone snitched and he was picked up. Now, they could not value what he stole, as safety box contents are unknown. But because of this dude, all banks now fill the space where the two safety cabinets meet with concrete. Actually made a movie called Inside Man, which was loosely based on him. His name was William Smarto. Story 10. Not a cop, but this was pretty smart. I used to run bars at a number of venues around the north of England, one of which was Chester Racecourse. Usually, we just have to keep an eye out for scousers trying to nick drinks or sneak in without paying, and with it being so close to Liverpool, there was a fair amount of security on site. You could tell them as they'd be suited, booted, a high-vis waistcoat on, and usually carrying a radio. Now, there were a dozen or so bars dotted around the course, and you can imagine the amount of money that was taken from 100,000 or so punters drinking steadily from 11 until 8 or 9 in the evening. So every hour or so, the security would go round the bars in turn and take all of the high-denomination notes from each till and stick them in the safe in the main building. So I stood there one day, pulling pints doing the barman thing, and the security blokes have been around a few times, and it's getting steadily busier. And then one bloke shows up on his own, high-vis and the radio in his hand, does the till, leaving the usual receipt so he can balance up at the end of the meeting. It's a bit early, I think, but hey, I've got plenty to do. And then 10 minutes later or so, 2 more blokes show up dressed the same way. And I said, "Oh, your mate's just been here. No need to touch that just yet." And they're like, "What mate? We're the only one doing this duty today." Cue a rapid fire and increasingly panic exchange on the radio. The guy who'd done the till before used to work there apparently, so he knew the drill, and he'd been watching the guards and knew just when to time it and what order they were going to round the bars in. Apparently, he got around 9 or 10 before he decided not to push his luck any further and walked away with about 80 grand. Just took off his high-vis vest, dumped that and the radio, and he's just one more guy in a suit in a crowd of thousands. They were a bit stricter on the policy after that. This sort of supports the theory that if you walk into any event wearing a high-vis vest and have a clipboard, maybe even a hard hat, you will look so official that no one will even question what you're doing there. And on top of that, if you walk around with supreme confidence, like you own the place, who is going to stop someone like that? They are clearly important and on a mission and cannot be bothered for anything. This was a smart little heist. Story 11. I worked with this one guy who had a lengthy record. Now, he had a system of getting released if he got caught. After committing a crime, if the police were in pursuit, he knew he was about to be cornered. He would act insane. His girl would play along with it, telling the police that he was off his medication. The police would arrest him, but then send him to a mental ward with papers instructing the ward to release to the police once he was cleared. Once he was in the mental ward, he would cause a distraction that would make the person attending the desk with the file cabinet to leave said cabinet. He would then crawl to the file cabinet, look for his release to police papers, and then would literally eat the papers. When the psych evaluators decided that he was stable enough to be released, there would be no instructions to send him to the police and that he would be released to the general public. He did this about 10 times until police officers noticed him back on the streets. This stunt forced the state to change their procedure for detaining mentally unstable suspects. Story 12. One guy would print barcodes, bring them into Home Depot, and stick them on merchandise in the $100 range. When the items were scanned, they would come up around the $10 range. Putting random barcodes on things isn't really illegal and super hard to notice. And then guy 2 would come in an hour later and buy the underpriced stuff. Complete plausible deniability. They would then sell the stuff on eBay. Now, the only reason they got caught is because the guy with the barcode printer and software cut the second guy out of the operation. So guy 2 stole a bunch of barcodes, put them on the merchandise, and then paid for it immediately afterwards. He then proceeded to rat on the first guy and spilled the beans that they'd been doing this on a weekly basis for over 4 years. Because we could only pin the one case on him, the burglary was dropped down to a petty theft, and he walked away a few days later in county and a small fine. Dude probably took Home Depot for tens of thousands of dollars over the years. So, not a legal expert here, but wouldn't the best charge be theft anyway? Like, where is the burglary charge coming from? No wonder they dropped that charge, because if the person was in the store illegally during store hours, I'm not sure that qualifies as a burglary. I guess fraud and theft would be the appropriate charges here. And I hope that eBay was also notified, and that person to be banned from using their platform as well. I'm actually surprised that the staff didn't catch on sooner, because I would also assume a huge difference in price like that would attract some attention. Story 13. Not a cop, and this is not as smart as some of the guys on here, but it's probably one of the smartest robberies in my small city. One of the main streets is cut into a hillside, and as a result, there is a very steep and quite tall concrete-covered bank immediately behind the buildings. Between two buildings, there is a gap that was filled at the street end by an ATM. To access it for filling, the security staff went through the next door building, out a side door and into the gap, which had the ATM at one end and the steep bank at the other. On the Friday before Christmas, when the ATM was to be filled to the brim, one of the robbers went down to the bank at night into the gap and waited for the guys to arrive to fill the ATM. They came early in the morning. As they came through the door into the gap, he held them up, took the money, and took off through the building to an accomplice waiting in a van on the main street. Then the van took off on the main road out the city and vanished. After a big search, the police finally found the burnt-out van, and it turned out the gang had driven it up a gorge road and had two other accomplices in cars at the top and bottom of the gorge who simultaneously drove really slowly into the gorge and held up the traffic so that no one was there to see them when they turned off down the access road into some brush. They ended up being caught because one of the gang was a former employee of the security company. Story 14. Friend's older brother and friends used to rob cars. Never did it anywhere except for movie theaters, because it was guaranteed those people aren't coming back out for 2 hours. They take their girlfriends, 2 guys and 2 girls, wait in their car, and then hang out until they saw a car with way too much money, usually booming bass and loud music, which guaranteed a few grand worth of stereo equipment. And then they'd wait until the driver went in, give it about another 30 minutes just to be safe, and then they'd all walk over together and use a center punch to knock out the driver's window and push it into the seat in one piece. Immediately, they'd open the doors and cut the alarm wires if there was an alarm going off. And then they'd just start hanging out. So even if someone in the lot noticed the alarm and then turned over to look, they just saw 2 guys and 2 girls near a car with the doors open, looking like the driver was a dumbo who forgot to turn off his alarm, which was confirmed when it went off in a few seconds. Then they proceed to just clean out the car, usually amps, subwoofers, speakers, etc., right in broad daylight. With 4 of them, it just looked like some guys working on their stereo. They close the doors and then leave. They did this for about a year or 2 before eventually getting caught because a father was waiting for his kids to come out and saw the entire process happen. They did some time. Now, it was one of the smartest and stupidest things I'd ever heard about. I'd give about an 8 out of 10 for brilliance and longevity. Sounds like they got away with it for quite a while, and probably would have done even more if they'd been a little bit more careful. It's a good system too, because it masters the art of just blending in and acting so unassuming. Countless people probably looked right at this group and didn't think anything of it. And also, that's a very smart use of an area like a movie theater where you know that you're going to get consistent 2-hour windows of opportunities. This confirms the phrase, if it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid.